He wasn't supposed to be on the 42nd floor. The executive suite was a ghost town of glass and steel. The only sound the low hum of the HVAC system. Until it wasn't. The door to the data processing nook was ajar, a sliver of harsh fluorescent light cutting across the expensive carpet. He thought it was a security lapse. Then he heard it, the sharp, hitching breath of someone trying to swallow their own grief. When Qin stepped into the light, he didn't see a worker finishing a late shift. He saw Sandra, curled into a ball behind a desk, her simple blue blouse wrinkled from a struggle, her eyes squeezed shut as if bracing for a strike. In that frozen moment, he realized this wasn't a breakdown. It was a haunting. Qin, a man whose name is whispered in the underworld and completely unknown to his own corporate employees, arrives at his legitimate headquarters under the cover of darkness. He is there for a cold, mechanical task, retrieving encrypted drives. Instead, he stumbles upon Sandra First, an invisible night shift worker trembling in the corner of a darkened office. As he stands over her, Qin observes the calculated nature of her fear, the way she pulls her knees to her chest and refuses to look up, expecting punishment rather than a rescue. He sees the bruises that the sleek corporate lighting usually hides. Though his life is built on ignoring collateral damage, the sight of a predator operating in his house triggers a cold, lethal curiosity. He doesn't announce himself as the owner or the boss. He remains a shadow, approaching her with a measured, ambiguous calm that earns the first flicker of her trust. In that silent, high-tension office, Qin makes a silent vow. He will peel back the layers of this corporate perfection to find the monster hiding in plain sight, and he will end their career before the sun rises. The glass of the Sterling Heights Tower didn't just reflect the Seoul skyline, it swallowed it. At 2:14 a.m., the building was a vertical graveyard of ambition, silent save for the rhythmic hum of the climate control systems. Qin stepped out of the private elevator on the 42nd floor, his footfalls making no sound on the heavy silk weave carpet. He didn't wear the expression of a CEO. He wore the face of a man who owned the air people breathed, but felt no need to announce his presence to the lungs using it. To the world, the conglomerate was a titan of logistics and offshore holdings. To Qin, it was a clean front, a necessary sterile skin that stretched over the jagged bones of his true empire. He practiced a philosophy he called corporate ghosting. A true king, he believed, was most powerful when he was a myth. If the employees never saw the hand that signed their checks, they would never know which shadow to fear. He moved through the open-plan office, a predatory silhouette in a $4,000 charcoal suit, heading toward the secure server room to retrieve the encrypted drives that held the week's unlisted transactions. The office at night was an alien landscape. Rows of empty ergonomic chairs stood like skeletal soldiers, and the blue standby lights of monitors blinked like dying stars. Qin took a shortcut through the data processing wing, a place he usually considered beneath his notice. This was the engine room, populated during the day by the invisible tier, the ones who moved numbers from one ledger to another without ever understanding the weight of the wealth they were touching. He paused near a cluster of cubicles, his nostrils flaring. The air here was different. It lacked the sterile, ozonated scent of the executive levels. It smelled of stale coffee, cheap polyester, and something sharper, the copper tang of adrenaline and the salt of dried tears. Qin didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in breaches. A security lapse was a crack in the hull of his ship, and he was a man who hated leaks. He turned the corner, expecting perhaps a forgotten window or a malfunctioning sensor. Instead, he found the source of the rot. A sliver of light from a desk lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating a pair of scuffed, sensible shoes tucked beneath a desk. He stopped, his posture tall and unshakable, eyes narrowing as he looked down. There, huddled in the narrow gap between a filing cabinet and a workstation, was a woman. She was small, shrinking into herself as if trying to occupy a different dimension. Her hair, a messy nest of dark strands, veiled a face that was tight with a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Qinhua didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in breaches. A security lapse was a crack in the hull of his ship, and he was a man who hated leaks. He turned the corner, expecting perhaps a forgotten window or a malfunctioning sensor. Instead, he found the source of the rot. A sliver of light from a desk lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating a pair of scuffed, sensible shoes tucked beneath a desk. He stopped, his posture tall and unshakable, eyes narrowing as he looked down. There, huddled in the narrow gap between a filing cabinet and a workstation, was a woman. She was small, shrinking into herself as if trying to occupy a different dimension. Her hair, a messy nest of dark strands, veiled a face that was tight with a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. Qinhua didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in breaches. A security lapse was a crack in the hull of his ship, and he was a man who hated leaks. He turned the corner, expecting perhaps a forgotten window or a malfunctioning sensor. Instead, he found the source of the rot. A sliver of light from a desk lamp cut through the gloom, illuminating a pair of scuffed, sensible shoes tucked beneath a desk. He stopped, his posture tall and unshakable, eyes narrowing as he looked down. There, huddled in the narrow gap between a filing cabinet and a workstation, was a woman. She was small, shrinking into herself as if trying to occupy a different dimension. Her hair, a messy nest of dark strands, veiled a face that was tight with a terror so profound it seemed to vibrate in the air between them. The silence of the 42nd floor was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with the jagged rhythm of Sandra's breath. Qinhua didn't move. He stood like a monolith of charcoal wool and cold intent, watching the woman transition from shock to a practiced, heartbreaking kind of orphaning. She didn't scream. She didn't call for help. Instead, Sandra first pulled her knees tighter to her chest, her knuckles white as she gripped her shins, trying to make her small frame occupy the smallest possible volume of space. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp that barely carried past the edge of the desk. She wouldn't look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the polished tips of his shoes, her eyes wide and glassy with a terror that had been curated over months of midnight shifts. "I'm almost done. I just needed a minute. Please don't tell Mr. Thorne. I'll have the data logs cleared by 4. I promise." Qinhua felt a cold ripple of irritation, not at her presence, but at her assumption. In her eyes, he was just another high-level predator, perhaps a security chief or a late-working director, who would see her bruised temple and messy hair as a messy liability to be swept away. She expected a reprimand, a dismissal, or worse, the same indifferent cruelty she had clearly come to accept as the cost of her paycheck. "Who did that to your face?" Qinhua's voice was a low, melodic blade. It wasn't the voice of a savior, it was the voice of an auditor finding a discrepancy in the books. Sandra flinched at the sound, her shoulders hunching forward as if expecting a blow to follow the question. She finally looked up, her vision swimming, seeing only the sharp silhouette of a man who looked too expensive for this floor. She saw the palm of his hand slightly open, an ambiguous gesture that felt like an interrogation. To her, he was just another cog in the machine that was crushing her. "It was an accident," she lied, the words coming out in a rhythmic, rehearsed cadence. "I tripped in the break room. It's my fault. I'm clumsy. Please, just let me finish the shift. I need this job." She looked at him then, and for a fleeting second her resignation met his calculation. She didn't see the invisible king of the Korean underworld. She saw a man who would undoubtedly choose his own convenience over her survival. She had been conditioned to believe that in this tower of glass and steel, the powerful only looked down to see what they were stepping on.
Qinhua watched the light of hope die in her eyes before it even had a chance to flicker, replaced by a dull, hollowed-out compliance. He didn't correct her, he didn't offer a hand to pull her up. He simply watched her, memorizing the shape of her fear and the name she had breathed with such visceral dread. Thorn. The audit had begun. Qinhua did not offer a hand. To offer a hand was to offer an alliance, and he was still calculating the cost of this particular broken asset. Instead, he stepped back, retreating into the penumbra where the office lights failed to reach. He watched Sandra scramble to her feet, her movements jerky and frantic, like a wounded bird trying to hide a broken wing from a hawk. She fumbled with a stack of papers, her head bowed, refusing to meet the cold, dark vacuum of his stare. She moved to steady herself against the mahogany desk, her sleeve rode up. Qinhua's eyes, trained to find the smallest flaw in a ledger or a lie, locked on her wrist. It wasn't a bruise, it was a map of violence. 4 distinct purplish indentations circled the thin bone, the unmistakable signature of a large hand squeezing with enough force to stop the blood. It was fresh, the edges still angry and red. "You're dropping things." Qinhua's voice was a low, melodic vibration that stalled her heart. He pointed to the floor. Near the leg of the heavy swivel chair lay a plastic rectangle, snapped clean in half. It was her employee ID badge. The clip was still attached to a jagged shard of her blue blouse, torn away with such structural violence that the threads were frayed like nerves. Sandra looked at the ruined plastic, her face ashen. She didn't reach for it. She looked at it with a hollow, haunted recognition, as if the broken badge represented her own severed connection to safety. "I'll fix it," she stammered, her voice thin enough to break. "A bit of tape. It's fine. Everything is fine." Qinhua didn't respond. He moved past her, his coat brushing against the desk with a sound like a drawn blade. He stopped at the edge of the light and knelt, his movements fluid and aristocratic. He picked up the broken half of the badge. Sandra first, data analyst, level 2. The photo showed a woman that still had light in her eyes, a version of herself that had existed before the 42nd floor became a cage. He stood, the plastic shard disappearing into his palm. He looked at the desk, noting a spilled bottle of water and the way a heavy stapler had been knocked to the floor as if a body had been slammed against the surface. The geometry of the struggle was written in the disarray. Thorn hadn't just been angry, he had been exerting ownership. Sandra was watching him now, her breath coming in shallow, terrified hitches. She saw him looking at the wreckage, and the shame in her eyes was a physical weight. To her, he was a witness to her degradation. To Qinhua, he was a forensic specialist looking at a crime scene in his own living room. He turned toward the elevator, the encrypted drives he had come for forgotten in the wake of a much more interesting discrepancy. "Go home, Sandra first." He left her standing in the flickering light of the cubicle, a small, trembling figure amidst the traces of a monster. As the elevator doors hissed shut, Qinhua felt the familiar, icy thrill of the hunt. Marcus Thorn had left his fingerprints on the king's property, and in Qinhua's world, that was a debt that could only be settled in blood or something much more painful.
The private study in Qinhua's penthouse didn't overlook the city, it loomed above it, a dark sanctuary of obsidian glass and silent servers. He sat behind a desk carved from a single slab of petrified wood, the broken shard of Sandra's ID badge resting in the center of the blotter like a bone from a shipwreck. He didn't use the company's internal network. That was a playground for bureaucrats and amateurs. Instead, he pulled a sleek, unmarked laptop from a hidden drawer, a terminal that bypassed the surface web entirely. With a single command, a localized, encrypted channel flickered to life. On the other end, in a basement halfway across the globe, a ghost began to stir. Qinhua's underworld associates didn't ask questions. They lived in the binary spaces between laws. Marcus Thorne, Chinhua said, his voice barely a whisper against the cool air. Senior Vice President. I want the reality, not the resume. The screen began to bleed data. To the Sterling Heights HR department, Thorne was a golden boy, a high-yield asset with a flawless record and a knack for optimizing staff performance. But as the hackers peeled back the digital skin, the rot became visible. Underneath the official files lay a hidden directory protected by a secondary firewall that shouldn't have existed. It was a digital graveyard. Chinhua watched as names scrolled past, former assistants, junior processors, interns, all women, all gone within 6 months of being assigned to Thorne's floor. The official reasons were a monotonous litany: resigned for personal reasons, failed to meet performance metrics, mutual separation agreement. But the ghosts found the payment trails, private settlements disguised as consulting fees or severance bonuses, all routed through a shell company Thorne had buried in the Cayman accounts. He's not just a predator, Chinhua murmured, his eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the monitor. He's a thief. The deep dives revealed the kickback scheme. Thorne was skimming from the facility maintenance budget, overbilling for phantom repairs, and pocketing the difference to fund his silence money. The HR director, a man named Miller, wasn't just turning a blind eye, he was taking a 15% cut of the hush fund to ensure that complaints like Sandra's never reached a formal file. They had built a perfect ecosystem of terror, fueled by the company's own capital. Chinhua leaned back, the shadows of the room swallowing his frame. In the underworld, a man who stole from his brothers was executed. In the corporate world, apparently, he was promoted. He stared at the digitized image of Thorne's smug, well-groomed face. The man thought he was a shark in a private pond, unaware that the ocean itself had just taken notice of him. Chinhua closed the laptop with a soft, final click. The evidence was gathered. Now it was time to watch the monster at play. The next morning, Chinhua did not go to the 42nd floor. Instead, he sat in the darkened monitoring substation of the building's basement, a place where the air was chilled to protect the humming servers, and the only light came from a wall of 64 high-definition displays. He sat in a high-backed leather chair, a silent conductor overseeing a symphony of mundane corporate life. He adjusted a dial, and the center screen bloomed with the sight of the data processing wing. The camera was a wide-angle lens, positioned to capture the entire floor, but Chinhua zoomed in until Sandra's workstation filled the frame. She looked smaller in the daylight. The harsh, overhead LEDs washed out her skin, making her look like a charcoal sketch of a person. She was wearing a different blouse, beige, high-collared, an attempt to button up her dignity, but her movements were stiff, her neck rigid. She worked with a frantic, desperate focus, her fingers flying across the keys as if speed could buy her safety. At 10:14 a.m., Marcus Thorne entered the frame. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like the vision of success the company sold to its shareholders. Tall, conventionally handsome, and a smile that was perfectly symmetrical. He moved through the cubicles with an easy, practiced grace, occasionally dropping a hand on a shoulder or sharing a laugh. But Chinhua watched the way the air changed as Thorne approached Sandra's desk. The workers in the neighboring cubicles didn't look up. They looked down, their bodies instinctively recoiling into a bystander hunch. Thorne didn't yell, he didn't strike her. Instead, he leaned over her desk, placing both hands on the laminate surface, effectively pinning her into her chair. From the high-angle feed, it looked like a lover's lean, but Chinhua saw the way Sandra's spine hit the back of her seat. Thorne began to speak, his face inches from hers. He picked up a stray pen from her desk and began to click it. Click, 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 a rhythmic, psychological metronome. Qinhua watched Sandra's hands. They had stopped typing. They were gripped together in her lap, trembling so violently that the motion was visible even through the digital grain. Thorne reached out and adjusted her collar, a gesture of intimate possession that made her flinch. He lingered there, his thumb grazing the skin where the bruise was hidden, his lips moving in a slow, whispered monologue. It was a masterclass in domesticating fear. Thorne wasn't just managing an employee, he was breaking a spirit in plain sight of 50 people who were too afraid to see it. He laughed once, patted the top of her monitor, and walked away, leaving Sandra staring at a flickering cursor. She didn't move for 3 full minutes. She simply sat there, a broken ghost in a glass cage. Qinhua reached out and touched the screen, his fingertip resting on Thorne's departing back. His confidence was his greatest asset, and soon it would be his most spectacular liability. The king had seen enough. The predator had enjoyed his last morning in the sun.
The shadows of the monitoring substation seemed to deepen as Qinhua transitioned from the live feed to the digital marrow of the company's ledger. He didn't need a hacker for this. He needed the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime laundering the gray areas of global commerce. He pulled up the facility maintenance budget for the 42nd floor, a mundane spreadsheet of janitorial supplies, HVAC repairs, and lighting retrofits. To a standard auditor, the numbers were boring. To Qinhua, they were a confession. He traced a recurring line item: consultancy, operational flow diagnostics. Every month for 18 months, a payment of $6,000 was issued to a firm called Aegis Management Solutions. Qinhua's fingers danced across the glass of his tablet, pulling the corporate registration for Aegis. It was a shell, a paper ghost registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, but the ghost had a beneficiary. With a few keystrokes, he bypassed the secondary encryption on the firm's payout account. The funds didn't stay in Delaware. They were split with surgical precision. 85% flowed into a private brokerage account held by Marcus Thorne. The remaining 15%, the Judas share, slid into an offshore account belonging to Miller, the HR director. "The price of a soul is surprisingly consistent," Qinhua remarked to the empty, chilled room. The paper trail was a masterpiece of mid-level corruption. Thorne wasn't just skimming, he was using the company's own money to buy the very mechanism meant to protect its workers. Every time Sandra or the women before her had considered speaking up, they were walking into a trap funded by the light bulbs above their heads. Miller wasn't just ignoring the abuse, he was a silent partner in it, a sentinel paid to ensure the invisible stayed silent. He scrolled further, finding the metadata on the performance review files. Miller had personally deleted 3 formal complaints in the last fiscal year alone. Each deletion was timestamped within an hour of a deposit into his offshore account. The synchronicity was chilling. It wasn't just a series of bad decisions. It was a business model built on the broken bones of the staff. He leaned back, the blue light of the data illuminating the cold, sharp angles of his face. Thorne and Miller thought they were playing a clever game of corporate chess, unaware that the board they were standing on was owned by a grand master who didn't play by their rules. They had stolen from the king to hide their sins against the weak. Qinhua closed the file, the digital evidence now etched into a secure, encrypted drive. The hunt was no longer about a bruised girl in a corner. It was about an infection in his house. In the underworld, an infection was handled with a blade. In this tower, he would use something much more surgical. The paper trail was complete. The trap was set. Now all that remained was the summons. The call reached Marcus Thorne at 2:48 a.m., vibrating against his mahogany nightstand with the persistence of an alarm. He answered with the groggy irritation of a man who believed his time was the most expensive commodity in the building. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, a cool, clipped monotone that claimed to be from Global Compliance. There was a critical data discrepancy on the 42nd floor, the voice said. It required a physical biometric override that only a senior VP could provide. Thorne's heart did a slow, sickening roll in his chest, but he suppressed it. He was a master of the cover-up. He had paid Miller enough to ensure the shadows stayed buried. 30 minutes later, the Sterling Heights Tower was a monolith of black glass against a bruised purple sky. Thorne stepped into the lobby, his heavy overcoat draped over a suit he had thrown on in haste. The lobby was empty, the marble floors polished to a mirror shine that made him feel as though he were walking on water. The elevators were already waiting, their doors sliding open with a soft, predatory hiss. As the car ascended, Thorne checked his reflection in the gold-tinted mirror. He straightened his tie, practicing the face of a concerned leader. He would walk in, sign whatever digital ledger they needed, and bury the discrepancy before the sun rose. But as the elevator bypassed the lower floors, the lights inside the carriage flickered, a brief, stuttering heartbeat of electricity that left him in total darkness for a second too long. When the doors opened on the 42nd floor, the air was freezing. The HVAC had been cranked down to a clinical chill. The main lights were off, leaving the vast expanse of cubicles in a state of deep oceanic blue. Only the far corner, the data processing wing, was illuminated. A single desk lamp was turned toward the center of the room, creating a harsh interrogation-style glare. Thorne's footsteps echoed, too loud and too hollow. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking against the silence. "Miller, is that you?" There was no answer, only the click, click, click of a pen. He rounded the corner to Sandra's workstation, his breath hitching. The desk was immaculate, except for a single object sitting in the center of the blotter, a plastic ID badge snapped cleanly in half. Beside it sat a tablet, its screen glowing with a spreadsheet he recognized too well. The Aegis Management payout logs, highlighted in blood red. Thorne spun around, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Who's there?" Out of the darkness behind the executive glass, a figure emerged. It wasn't Miller. It wasn't a security guard. It was a man in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. He moved with a terrifying, liquid grace, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. Chinois stepped into the circle of light, his eyes dark and bottomless. He didn't look like a corporate auditor. He looked like the end of the world. "Sit down, Marcus," Chinois said, a low, melodic threat. "We have a great deal to discuss before the cleaners arrive to scrub the floor."
Thorne didn't sit. His survival instincts, honed through years of corporate backstabbing, screamed at him to run, but his legs felt anchored to the expensive carpet. He looked at the man in the charcoal suit, then at the glowing tablet displaying his offshore accounts, and finally at the broken ID badge. He tried to summon the bluster that had kept the 42nd floor in a state of perpetual submission. "I don't know who you think you are," Thorne spat, his voice trembling despite his efforts, "but you're trespassing. I'll have security up here in 30 seconds. I'll have you blacklisted from every firm in the city." Chinois didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He simply reached out and picked up the broken half of Sandra's badge, turning it over in his fingers. "Security is currently occupied, Marcus. They are helping Mr. Miller pack his desk. It seems he had a sudden, very urgent desire to resign before the police arrived to discuss his tax evasion." Thorne's face drained of color, the red splotches of his anger turning a sickly, bruised gray. "Miller? What are you—" Chinois interrupted, his voice a low, melodic blade that seemed to vibrate in the very glass of the windows. He stepped fully into the light, the sharp angles of his face as cold and unforgiving as a winter morning in Seoul. "To the world, I am a ghost. To this company, I am the chairman of the board. But to men like you, I am the consequence you thought you were too clever to face." The realization hit Thorne like a physical blow.
He wasn't looking at a consultant or a rival VP. He was looking at the silent owner of the empire, the man whose name was never spoken, only feared. Thorne's knees finally gave out, and he slumped into the chair he had once used to pin Sandra first into a corner. "I can explain the Aegis accounts," Thorne whispered, his hands shaking so violently he had to tuck them under his thighs. "It was a reorganization strategy, a misunderstanding. I am not here for the money, Marcus," Thorne said, leaning down until his eyes were level with Thorne's. The predator had become the prey, shrinking back just as Sandra had done only 48 hours ago. Chinhua placed the broken ID badge on Thorne's chest, pinning it there with a single steady finger. "By dawn, every asset you own will be frozen. Every firm in this city will receive a dossier on your management style. You won't be blacklisted, Marcus. You will be erased. You will walk out of this building tonight, and you will never hold a pen, a paycheck, or a position of power again." Thorne looked up, pleading, but he found no mercy in the dark vacuum of Chinhua's stare. The performance review was over. The career was dead. And as Chinhua turned to walk back into the shadows, he didn't look back at the ruin he had left behind. He was already thinking of the light that would find Sandra's desk in the morning. The sun rose over the city in a bleed of pale gold and industrial gray, its light unsparing as it struck the glass of the Sterling Heights tower. Sandra first stepped off the elevator with her shoulders hunched, her hand instinctively clutching the strap of her bag as she braced for the familiar, suffocating weight of the 42nd floor. She expected the sneer of the security guards, the pointed silence of her colleagues, and the inevitable shadow of Marcus Thorne looming over her workstation. Instead, she found a ghost town. The air on the floor was different, no longer heavy with the metallic scent of fear, but strangely, impossibly clear. As she walked toward her desk, she realized the glass-walled corner office was wide open. The nameplate that had read Marcus Thorne, Senior Vice President, was gone, leaving only a faint rectangular adhesive stain on the door. Inside, the desk was stripped bare. No personal photos, no expensive pens, no leather-bound planners. It looked as though the man had never existed at all, scrubbed from the corporate architecture with surgical precision. Sandra reached her workstation and stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. Sitting in the center of her desk was a small cream-colored envelope made of heavy, expensive cardstock. Beside it lay a new ID badge, whole, polished, and bearing a title she had only ever dreamed of in the quietest hours of her life: Senior Operations Analyst. With trembling fingers, she slid a silver letter opener through the seal. There was no signature at the bottom, no corporate logo, and no fine print. There were only 3 lines written in a precise, elegant hand that felt as ancient and immutable as the stone of the building. "The debt has been settled. You are no longer invisible in this house. Your education has been fully funded. Use it to ensure no one else ever feels the need to hide in the dark." Sandra looked up, her eyes blurring with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. She looked toward the executive elevators, where a tall, solitary figure in a charcoal suit was stepping into the shadows of the lobby, invisible to the world, but finally, unforgettably seen by her. For the first time, she didn't shrink. She stood tall, adjusted her new badge, and began to type. The invisible king had moved on, leaving behind a kingdom that was finally beginning to breathe. The dawn wasn't just a change in light, it was the start of a life where Sandra First would never have to be a ghost again.
6 months later, the 42nd floor of the Sterling Heights Tower no longer felt like a subterranean vault. The heavy, tinted film had been stripped from the windows, allowing the amber glow of the Seoul sunset to pour over the workstations. Sandra First stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, a leather-bound portfolio tucked under her arm. She was no longer the woman who tried to merge with the steel of a filing cabinet. Her hair was pulled back in a sharp, professional taper, and her movements carried the quiet, centered gravity of someone who knew exactly where they stood. As the newly appointed Director of Operational Integrity, her mandate was simple: transparency. She had spent the last 2 terms in an accelerated executive program, her tuition paid by a silent trust that didn't appear on any public ledger. She looked down at her desk, where a small, framed photo sat, not of a person, but of the city skyline at 2 a.m. It was a reminder of the night the invisible king had found her. The elevator chimes rang, a low melodic sound that signaled the end of the shift. The staff filtered out, laughing and trading plans for dinner, a casual human noise that had been extinct under Thorne's reign. Sandra stayed behind for a moment, enjoying the stillness. A shadow fell across her desk. She didn't flinch, she didn't pull her knees to her chest. She turned slowly, her gaze meeting the dark, inscrutable eyes of the man in the charcoal suit. Chinhua looked exactly as he had that night, composed, lethal, and devastatingly expensive. He didn't speak. He simply surveyed the room, his eyes lingering on the open doors of the offices and the relaxed posture of the night security guard. "The reports are on your private server," Sandra said, her voice steady and clear. "The audit of the regional branches is complete. The rot has been excised." Chinhua walked to the window, looking out at the empire he owned but never touched. "And the cost, Director First?" "Higher than expected," she replied, stepping up to stand beside him, not behind him. "But the foundation is finally solid. No more ghosts." Chinhua offered a ghost of a smile, a rare, fleeting fracture in his marble composure. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy object, placing it on the ledge between them. It was a gold fountain pen, engraved with the initials SF. "A king only needs shadows when his house is full of thieves," he said, his voice a low, resonant hum. "It seems I can finally step into the light." He turned and walked toward the private elevator without another word. Sandra picked up the pen, the metal warm from his touch. She watched the reflection of the invisible king vanish into the mirrored doors, knowing that while he might never be seen by the world, he would never be a stranger to her again. The tower was silent, but for the first time in its history, it was a silence of peace, not of secrets. The debt was settled. The sun had finally finished rising.